we need to pray for the Muslim world. The Muslim Middle East and the 1040 window are the largest mission field in the world, the most neglected mission field in the world, and the area where most of the persecution of the church takes place as well. And the Middle East is a quagmire of all sorts of violence, persecution. You have the highest human suffering index, the lowest freedom index in the Muslim Middle East, and the largest group of unreached people in the world. By the way, the largest unreached people group in the world are the Turks. And that used to be, good evening, that used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. Now, Syria is in the news, sadly so. Now, Syria is a biblical country. The town of Antioch, where believers were first called Christians, is in what is still Syria today. And Damascus, the road to Damascus, where the Apostle Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. You know, this is all in present-day Syria. Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. So Damascus is a biblical city. I mean, just think of Paul or Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus and how everything changed. Now, the gruesome spectacle unfolding in Syria in the last few days was totally predictable. Once President Assad's secular government fell, after surviving 14 years of terrorism, sabotage, sanctions, intrigue, all kinds of secret plots by 14 different countries plotting to overthrow them. Damascus fell by relying too much on the Astana format agreements and promises of Western politicians, which are not worth the paper they're written on, and trusting Turkey and the Gulf petro monarchies. Syria is an unusual Arab state. It lacks oil, but it's still very strategically important. Syria consists of mountains, deserts, and fertile plains. It's quite a phenomenal country, actually. It was one of the most prosperous and productive countries in the Middle East. Once part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Syria was granted independence from France in 1946. When the Turks were defeated in the Second World War, Britain and France divided up their empire, and Syria went to France, and France held it between the First and the Second World War. The Versailles Treaty granted Syria to France, and they declared their independence in 1945, but the French army only left in 1946. Well, they had continuous upheavals and coups d'etats and attempted revolutions from 1949 all the way through till 1970. But 1970, there was a military coup that brought internal stability, and this was the father of Bashar al-Assad. It was Hafiz al-Assad, who became the first leader after the 1970 coup. Of course, Syria is bordering on Lebanon, which also has many different religious minorities, a wide variety of Muslim groups, and also Christians. Now, Syria won the war on the ground, but Damascus lost the pretended peace and ultimately fell under the attack of a new Western creation, and that was the jihadist militia, which is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a name the West media likes to abbreviate to HTS. It's an acronym that's reminiscent of a high-tech company, and therefore, in the eyes of a distracted public, it allows its true nature to be blunted beneath a veneer of familiarity. So instead of saying Al-Qaeda or jihadist terrorists, mass murdering thugs, they call them HTS. Just sounds so much better than ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The fall of Damascus was a blow to all of us who trusted in the victory of reason and the rule of law. On the contrary, it was the worst that the terminal secular humanist West could offer the world, with the hypocritical statements of the European Union light years away from the paradise garden that it likes to believe it is. The EU jumped around with such excitement that Assad was gone and that these terrorists had taken over France, Britain, all over the West, even Germany, praising this ridiculously evil result. And this group of terrorists has been so well funded, bankrolled enormously by America, by USAID. USAID, by the way, claimed to have invested $15 billion in regime change in Syria over a 10-year period. $15 billion over a 10-year period. I mean, can you imagine what could be done for the gospel if you put $15 billion into a reputable organization? And what were the purposes of this war on Syria, which combined Saudi Arabia and Qatar and America, Britain, and a whole lot of other countries have combined together to bring down this government? Well, the crisis dates back to 2011, when the Obama administration in America orchestrated the overthrow of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi to seize its massive arsenal of advanced weapons. And I might add, the tremendous stocks of gold. Libya was using real money, and by the way, they didn't have a Rothschild-controlled bank. There's a few things that are coincidental. The enemies of the West in the 20th century have coincidentally all not had usury. They didn't have these Rothschild-controlled Federal Reserve banks, which are not federal, do not have reserves and are not banks. Stephen Mitford Goodson, in his History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, points out that by sheer coincidence, all the wars in the 20th century have been bankers' wars. The only countries in the world that didn't have a Rothschild-controlled bank, first of all, was Russia in the First World War, and then that was solved with the Bolshevik Revolution. And then Germany and Italy and Japan, the Second World War, didn't have Rothschild-controlled banks. That was solved with the Second World War. And then in recent times, Iraq, Libya, and Syria didn't have central controlled banks controlled by the Rothschilds using usury, where the government borrows money from a bank and people pay taxes forever afterwards to pay off the interest for those loans. And so, interestingly, Libya insisted on their oil being purchased with gold coins. And so they wanted a gold dinar. They didn't want dollars, they didn't want petrodollars. Next thing, they get overthrown, bombed by NATO, and chaos ensues. Well, these weapons that they confiscated from Libya's arsenal were then entrusted to the Syrian militants, or should I say terrorists, via Turkey. Turkey's played a very direct role in the betrayal of Syria. And under the CIA's covert program, Timber Sycamore, which was launched by Obama, the goal was to arm this jihadist army drawn from across the globe. By the way, there were 20,000 jihadists who were foreign to Syria. They called it a civil war, but the jihadists fighting in Syria came from as far afield as Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Britain, America. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some South African Muslims there too. But they had huge variety of foreigners in there. And so to call it a civil war when there were Pakistanis and Saudi Arabians, there was just such a wide variety of nationalities. 20,000 foreigners fighting in Syria, how can that be a civil war? Well, the war has resulted in 600,000 deaths, characterized by mass beheadings, systematic rape, crucifixions, other atrocities. One of the key figures to emerge from this conflict was Mohammed al-Jawlani, a former lieutenant of the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And al-Baghdadi was in prison in America. He was in Guantanamo Bay. And one of the first things Obama did was set this al-Baghdadi free and gave him the money with which he launched ISIS. And this is not a theory. This has been admitted by the Chief of Staff of US military, testified to the House of Congress in America. Yes, we started ISIS, but it was for good cause. It's to overthrow Assad's regime in Syria. And by the way, Ambassador Stevens, the one who got wiped out in Benghazi, he was the bagman. He carried the first 500 million in cash to al-Baghdadi, and that money came from Qatar. But Ambassador Stevens, before he became an ambassador, was the bagman who gave them the money with which they could launch ISIS. And so this al-Jawlani was such a wanted terrorist, the Americans put $10 million bounty on his head, wanted dead or alive. Once a prisoner of the US Army as well, he was mysteriously released just as the CIA activated Project Timber Sycamore in Syria. He became the leader of al-Nusra, later renamed the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which was in fact just Al-Qaeda in Syria. And that was just 10 years after Al-Qaeda had orchestrated the World Trade Center attacks, or at least they're the ones who got the blame. 19 of the men who were part of the terror attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were Al-Qaeda members. So after Al-Qaeda had caused the worst terrorist attack on American territory, 2 leaders of Al-Qaeda were released, al-Baghdadi and al-Jawlani, and they then went on to launch this new HTS in Syria. So Al-Qaeda in Syria, under its various names, became the core of the covert CIA operation to topple the constitutionally elected government of Bashar al-Assad. An anti-Syrian American-led alliance steadfastly supported his forces as they fought to overcome the legitimate government of Syria, what USAID called regime change. And USAID funded 8 different government overthrows or toppling of government regime changes, stretching from Ukraine most famously in 2014, all the way through to Syria most recently in 2024. Even though al-Jawlani himself was designated an especially dangerous terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head. But in the waning days of Biden's administration, Biden initiated a covert operation in conjunction with Turkey and other nations to make the final push to topple Assad. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar were all part of this. And exhausted by 14 years of Western blockades and debanking and sanctions, the US military occupation and seizure of its main food and fuel supplies in the north, Syria's forces finally succumb, I think just battle fatigue and exhaustion, leading to Jawlani's rise to power. The Syrian government was a stable, prosperous, constitutional state. The regime was a bastion of Arab nationalism resistant to radical jihad, which is quite remarkable. While Islam was recognized as the religion of the majority, Syria was a secular state which accorded religious freedom to the Christian minority. At 6.3%, the Christians in Syria were the largest group of Christians in the Muslim Middle East after Egypt. Now, there had been, and they used to be the 3rd largest, but Iraq lost most of their Christians after the Americans liberated them. So Iraq, you might recall, had 1.6 million Christians in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein protected the Christians because he knew that Christians don't assassinate. So all of his bodyguards and all of his cooks and catering staff were Christians. That's Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq. And if you went to downtown Baghdad, you'd see in the Baptist Church, First Baptist Church in downtown Baghdad, the organ, magnificent organ, gift of His Excellency the President, Saddam Hussein. And that was the same church where his bodyguards went to and so on. So after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, the number of Christians went from 1.6 million down to 100,000 in Iraq. That's virtually a genocide. I mean, literally, they lost over 1 million Christians, like 1.5 million Christians lost out of Iraq, either killed or fled. And that made then Syria the last country in the Middle East to accord religious freedom to Christians, and the 2nd largest group of Christians in the Middle East after Egypt. Well, this al-Jawlani suddenly shed his jihadist image. He donned a suit and tie, white shirt, and he rebranded himself as President Hammond al-Shara, claiming to be a moderate leader. However, his past atrocities, including thousands of rapes and thousands of beheadings, remains undeniable. One of his first acts as Syria's new ruler, interim president, was appointing Sadi al-Waisi as justice minister, a man who's been recorded on video personally ordering the execution of women for so-called adultery, which in many cases is not what we would call adultery, mind you. And so Sadi al-Waisi is the new justice minister in Syria. Doesn't bode well for justice. Now, the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, recently gave £50 million to this new terrorist government of Syria for inclusion. I think the people he's meant to include are the ones they've just dumped into mass graves. And this is for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so Britain entrusted £50 million to this mass murderer. And by the way, Germany German foreign minister, who's just as stupid as Lemmy, gave €50 million to this new government. All the governments of Western Europe were screaming with delight and clapping and applauding from the sidelines as Assad fell and fled and these terrorists took over in Damascus. Question, were the massacres against the Christians, the Shiites, and the general Alawite population not foreseeable? Yes, they were totally predictable. In fact, it was inevitable. The slaughter of the Alawites in Latika province marks the culmination of this brutal proxy war launched under Barack Hussein Obama and finalized by Joe Biden, one of the last achievements of Biden's regime, leading to the collapse of Syria's secular government and the rise of a radical terrorist regime. Syria was once admired as the most democratic country in the Middle East. And Syria had a constitutionally elected president, Bashar al-Assad, although he is continually called a dictator by the people waging war on him. They had an advanced constitution of 2812, which guaranteed freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and women's rights. Very remarkable in the Muslim Middle East. Now, you've all heard about these gas attacks. Apparently, Assad's government, when they were winning the war and when the terrorists were on the retreat, Ivaskilik, there'd suddenly be some gas atrocity. And they would broadcast across the Communist News Network and the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation, Slam magazine, Assad's using chemical attacks on his own people. Now, why would he do that? In a world where that's about the only thing you can't do. You can bomb people with phosphorus, you can bomb them with napalm, you can do all sorts of things, but don't use gas. If you use gas, then that's just a step too far, and then all hell's going to break loose on your heads. And, well, Syria's chemical attacks were always staged. On one occasion, I think Turkey was proven to have been the source. On another occasion, it was Saudi Arabia. But these were false flag staged attacks at the very moment that Assad would be winning. Then suddenly America would be given an excuse to launch a whole lot of cruise missiles into Syria, blow up some of the air bases, cause havoc amongst the people. And why would somebody who's winning the war do a gas attack? Something that is just string forbidden in the Western world. You just can't do that. And so whether it was sarin gas or chlorine gas bombs or mustard gas or phosphorus bombs, these were all rigged, totally staged, and it's been proven to be fabricated, false. But the world got hysterical about these things. You know, Assad is using chemical weapons on his own people. I mean, why doesn't he just bomb them and shoot them? But you can't gas them. I mean, that's just, you're not allowed to do that. Well, these are false flag operations. And they were done by Turkey, a member of NATO, and done by Saudi Arabia. And it was blamed on Assad's government, which is very convenient. Now, Syria is under the rule of an al-Qaeda warlord. And the country has descended into mass killings, terror, revenge massacres, targeting religious minorities. As Jalani's, now al-Sharia's forces, are solidifying control, they have quietly launched what they call combing operations to find and exterminate leaders of the Alawites, the Christians, and other religious minorities. The Alawite defenders were led by elite veterans of the 4th Division's Tiger Forces, who they were about to be arrested, so they defended themselves, which is understandable because they probably feared that they'd be tortured and murdered, which in fact was done, proving their point. And so this has now been recorded. There's been masses of these videos going out across the world. Social media is awash with them. You've probably seen some of these disgusting images. Piles of bodies, civilians, all unarmed, many cases women and children, people killed in cold blood, and the death toll of the thousands definitely rising, and entire families have been slaughtered in cold blood. Well, fearing mass execution, 9,000 civilians fled for sanctuary to the Russian military base at Hammond, which admitted them, and Russia's still got an air base and a naval base in Syria, and so the air base has now got thousands of refugees who fled there for sanctuary. When I was growing up, I could never have imagined anyone fleeing to a Russian base for sanctuary, but that's how the world has changed. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, issued the statement, "The United States condemns the radical Islamist terrorists, including foreign jihadis," and there are a lot of foreign jihadis, "that murdered people in Western Syria in recent days. The United States stands with Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, including the Christian, Druze, Alawite, and Kurdish communities, and offers its condolences to the victims and their families. Now, I'm sure that this is sincere, but it's not his fault, but it was the previous State Department, previous administration's policies that led to this disaster. Now, the Greek Prime Minister got an interesting insight. Antonis Samaras, he blasted the Western support for the Turkish-backed regime because what you've got in Syria right now is a Turkish puppet state, basically. What is happening in Syria is neo-Ottoman inspired. Remember, the Ottoman Turkish Empire once ruled all the way across the Balkans, including Greece, and they were even besieging the gates of Vienna at one time, and they pillaged Hungary, took Budapest, and took 200,000 Christians from Budapest as slaves to Istanbul, what then was called Constantinople. And so what you've got is Turkey is in some ways having a revival of the Ottoman Empire, and they are trying to take Syria back. And this could be part of their gambit. The terrorists of Ahmed al-Sharaa, who do not change just because he wore a tie, replacing an authoritarian leader with a leading member of al-Qaeda inevitably led to massacres of thousands of civilians and scenes of barbarism that humanity cannot bear. Many of the social media postings and on the video news, they've had to fade out some of the images because it's just too horrific. In a world that's fairly desensitized to violence, it's got to be pretty bad when they've got to blank those things out. So the Greek Prime Minister urged the European Union to condemn the massacres. Now, the European Union was singing the praises of this mass-murdering al-Qaeda terrorist just a few months ago when he came to power, and assuring us that this is a new era of freedom and peace and tolerance and diversity and equity and inclusion. And from one side of Europe to the other, there was applause, cheers. So I wouldn't hold my breath for the EU to condemn these massacres because it's done by their people. Despite his official denials, evidence suggests that the HTS leader al-Jilani, now al-Sharaa, ordered his fighters to stop filming the atrocities to avoid further international backlash. The original images we saw included pictures of body cams and people self-phoning, filming themselves, killing their victims in cold blood. So a lot of the original pictures actually came from his own people. So I'm sure he's quite wise to say, guys, this is counterproductive. Don't boast about this. You know, it's one thing to take a picture of the coffee you're having at Starbucks in the morning. It's another thing, you know, these are some Christians I'm killing this morning. And some people don't quite realize that's bad PR. Although Western media have long portrayed Assad as a brutal dictator, but I don't know if you've noticed the amount of pictures of him in churches. And I was trying to find my picture of that because I've got quite a lot of pictures of Assad with huge Christian delegations in their churches, surrounded by the people, no security evidence, just surrounded by Christian men, women, children, older people, in congregations. Most of his army, in many units, were Christian, because the Christians knew the only thing standing between them and being beheaded by ISIS or Al-Qaeda was Assad's regime. And so the mass extermination of Alawites and Christians is unfolding as a stark reminder of what happens when radical jihadists are handed power under the guise of democracy. This is another one of these democratic achievements. Western powers condemned President Assad for being overly harsh with Islamic terrorists who are invading Syria and murdering their people. But these events demonstrate that no leader, no matter how kind or enlightened, could possibly have suppressed such horrors without force. It is time we faced that reality. When the Biden administration toppled President Assad, there was no one left to defend the Syrians. Now the Alawite and Christian populations are dwindling under systematic extermination. Syria is being redrawn under the domination of one of the world's most dangerous terrorists. The question is, will Syria emerge as the new Islamic Caliphate? Will the world act before it's too late? This reminds us Rhodesia was betrayed, the same way Syria has just been betrayed. Rhodesia was targeted, and we were accused of being too harsh. Well, you're fighting communist terrorism. You're fighting people who shoot down civilian airliners and cook and eat the survivors. You're fighting people who herd Christians into a church and burnt down around them, who bayonet babies and massacre whole missionary families. How on earth can you deal with that without force? And yes, some of that force will be harsh, and you will have to kill some people, but honestly, how do you defend your people against violent terrorists without some force? So Rhodesia was betrayed. The Shah of Iran was betrayed. The whole of Iran was betrayed by the US government back under Jimmy Carter in 1979, 1980. And the Kurds, we should say, were also betrayed. The Kurds are a large nation. By the way, in the Bible, the Kurds are the Medes. So Darius the Mede, Darius was a Kurd. So the Kurds of today are the Medes of the Bible. And so Daniel was thrown in lion's den under Darius the Mede. Well, the Kurds should have been given their own country. They were big enough, like it would have been a 10, 12 million population country. And yet the Kurds were divided up between Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, with some in Syria. And by the way, it was Winston Churchill who did that. He was secretary for the colonies at the time, and he redrew the map of the Middle East to take the oil-rich area of Kuwait away from Iraq and to parcel up the Kurds amongst the Turks, the Iranians, and Iraqis, and so on. And so the Great Betrayal is written about how America abandoned the Kurds and lost the Middle East. Interesting perspective too. And then you've got to remember all the Christians of Eastern Europe were betrayed at Yalta by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. And so this unfortunately fits a pattern of betraying stable governments under the guise that they're a bit too harsh in how they deal with communist or Islamic jihadist terrorists and so on. And then you find that the liberators of yesterday become the oppressors of today. And that's what's happened now in Syria. So Syria just fits the pattern. Operation World, written by our friend Patrick Johnson, documented how in 2010, when we had the Lausanne 3 or Cape Town 2010 conference, which I was privileged to participate in, there were 15 million Christians in the Middle East. Today, we have less than 10 million Christians left in the Middle East. That is genocide proportions, to lose so much of. You talk about Christian families that date back for centuries, even millenniums. Doesn't matter how many missionaries we send to the Middle East, it'll never replace people who speak the language, who are part of the culture, who've been embedded there for generations. This is catastrophic. The Middle East is the only part of the world where the number of Christians and the percentage of Christians is going down. It's catastrophic. And to think between 2010 and 2015, we lost already 5 million Christians out of the Middle East. And Syria has had many different religious groupings. Notice the Christians are the brown. You can see the Christians are concentrated in the north, where a lot of these violent things are taking place, and in the south. Many have already fled into Lebanon and some into Jordan. You can see some are close to Lebanon here too. I don't think anyone's going to flee to Turkey, because that'll be out of the frying pan into the fire. But notice how so many of the wars in the world today are where Islam is bordering with other religions. And it's so good it's a religion of peace and tolerance. Imagine if they were violent. Imagine if they were intolerant. And so this is what's going on in Syria right now. And remember, this ISIS was founded by the United States of America, CIA. This is part of the Timber Sycamore program. And this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was in the American hands, locked up in Guantanamo Bay, and Obama set him loose and gave him $500 million to start ISIS. So what has happened in the last week is a direct result of those actions. Now, over 40 militant groups around the world, including in Africa, have pledged allegiance to ISIS. And this isn't complete. I see it doesn't include the jihadists in Mozambique, but Mozambique's jihadists also now are flying the black flag of ISIS. And of course, many of our friends in Nigeria who've been massacred by Boko Haram are an affiliate of ISIS. But you know, if you've got $500 million, you can finance a lot of terrorism. No wonder 2 Corinthians 6 says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? What part has a believer with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? You are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them. I will walk among them. I will be the God, and they will be my people. Therefore come out from amongst them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. Now, Europe used to be called Christendom. Europe used to be a Christian continent, and now it looks like an anti-Christian continent supporting evil. And USAID was abused to undermine Christian churches and freedom, and to think they invested $15 billion into regime change in Syria. And they've increased persecution for the church worldwide. To hell with USAID. May everyone involved in USAID in America determine their policies. May they all stand before the living God and be cast in the lake of fire. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Aid, development, democracy, freedom. I mean, they use nice words, but what's the result? And America's just poured billions and billions of dollars into increasing persecution of the church worldwide. ISIS, these men were funded, armed and trained and prepared by the United States. It's a CIA front operation, murdering unarmed civilians. Do you remember the 21 Egyptian Christians beheaded? People of the cross. ISIS kills us because of our religion. And who started ISIS? United States government. Barack Hussein Obama started ISIS, funded ISIS. And Christians in Egypt are still mourning the martyrs who were beheaded by ISIS. How does this fit into US foreign policy? They don't care about Christians, obviously. There was a Syrian pilot who was captured, and they put him in a cage, dressed him in an orange jumpsuit, because American prisoners in Guantanamo Bay are put in jumpsuits, and then they set him on fire. And of course, fire is bad enough, but when you can't flee, what a horrible way to die. Others, they put in orange jumpsuits and put them in cages and drowned them. I mean, the creativity put into how to murder people. Sick, sadistic scum. But to think they were funded by a NATO member, meaning Turkey, by an American ally, Saudi Arabia, by another American ally, Qatar, and by the US government, absolutely shocking. These characters, funded and trained by people who are meant to be our allies, just awash with funding. And Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and Turkey are all backing the terror group. The West's biggest allies are funding ISIS. And so somebody took this picture and changed it into this one. Stop America, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar from supporting ISIS terrorists. And unfortunately, that's true. Those are the flags that could be flying. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, America, they all have supported ISIS. ISIS has murdered Christians. So ISIS made in the USA. ISIS is a CIA operation, and that is confirmed. Wouldn't any mission love a fleet of Toyota Land Cruisers like this? Lovely vehicles, high quality vehicles, and weapons made in the USA. The rise of radical Islam is not a failure of US policy. It's precisely what the hidden hand of the deep state wants. Saudi funded and US backed in many ways. ISIS has been a tool of US foreign policy, particularly to topple the government in Syria. That's what they were started for. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they've practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. The way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Romans 3 can be stamped over these movements and the governments that supported them. Just think how many Christians have died, suffered, been bereaved in recent years as a result of Barack Hussein Obama, his Arab Spring, and ISIS, Al-Qaeda, HTS, and all these others. Like the Christians in Egypt. Egypt was once the superpower of the world. Egypt was once one of the most important countries in the world. And now Christians are a minority in what used to be their country. Copts, the Coptic church is the Egyptian church. A Copt is an Egyptian. But Copts are now something like 10% in a country that used to be all Coptic. Arabs from Saudi Arabia have colonized Egypt, and now the churches are being burned, bombed. car bombs, attacks on Christians. Now, all this happened because of US foreign policy, the Arab Spring. When they said, if we can get democracy in the Middle East, everything will be wonderful. Well, when you find the majority of the people who are Muslim support beheading apostates, beheading people who have changed their religion from Islam to something else, someone who's converted to Christ, if they can say freedom go to hell, what do you think democracy is going to do? In every case when democracy has been brought into a Muslim country, you've had radical Islamicists rising to power and exterminating the Christians, like happened in Iraq, where George Bush restored democracy, to quote himself. The Arab Spring tidal wave of popular Islamic fanaticism on the streets of the Middle East brought about a sharp increase of violent persecution of Christian communities. The Arab Spring was, in fact, a Christian winter. Hundreds of Christians were wounded or killed in violent acts on Christian churches and Christian neighborhoods, especially in Iraq and Egypt. Egypt was a country that once protected Christians. Mubarak literally put Egyptian soldiers outside every single church in Egypt to protect the church from radical Islamicists, like who America betrayed Egypt into the hands of. And Egypt in 2011 and 2012 became a scene of untold attacks on churches, car bombs, atrocities, burnings, arson attacks, murders of Christians, and the poor Christians caught in the middle of this, absolutely hideous. And there are still 12 million Christians in Egypt, and their life has been made much, much, much worse as a result of this US foreign policy. And of course, I'm not blaming the present administration. They're trying to stop all this and expose it and bring it to an end. But it was under previous American administration, especially Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who caused this. Christian women are under attack in Egypt for no other reason than they are Christian. I mean, can you imagine what these people have been through? Churches torched and burned. Some of these churches had stood for centuries, some for a millennium, and then burned out by the Muslim Brotherhood as the Arab Spring reached them. And now we know that the Arab Spring was completely funded, trained, organized by the USAID movement. Billions into regime change, toppling allies such as Egypt. Now, just think, as was said, to be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be America's friend is fatal. And the amount of Christians who suffered in Egypt, and these are our brothers and sisters in Christ. Just to remind you, in our glass display case, I've got these Coptic crosses, which are made from fish scales from the Nile River. Coptic minister John Benoop gave that to me, and he wanted me to bring a big icon of Jesus here. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm a Protestant, I can't accept that. So he gave me a little icon of St. Mark, who's the founder of the church in Egypt. So that we've got in the cabinet. But our friends and brethren in Egypt have suffered a lot. But these are tough Christians, and those who are saying, you know, it doesn't matter, who cares about the Copts, they're not real Christians. And I say, well, I'll question your salvation before I question theirs. People who are willing to suffer for Christ and die for Christ are my brothers in Christ. The greatest love is to be willing to give your life for another. There's no greater love, Jesus said. So how can we say these people are not Christians? They risk their lives by being true to Christ. And so Christians are being attacked in the name of Islam. And people who think they can bring democracy to a country that's got a fairly authoritarian government but allows religious freedom and freedom of speech and women's rights, how do you think it's going to improve when you get Islamicist radicals in through democracy? Democracy can't work amongst a population that believes that others shouldn't be allowed to have a different opinion. And so Iraqi Christians face genocide. They've gone from 1.6 million to 100,000 in a space of a few years since America liberated them. Freedom is not all it's cracked up to be. And tens of thousands of Christians packed up and fled the region. Some estimates are more than half the total population of Christians in Iraq have fled the country. In fact, it's much more than that now. Considering that these Christians came from communities which have survived centuries of Islamic persecution, only to be uprooted today because of the Arab Spring, sponsored by the US State Department and USAID, shows how severe this new wave of ruthless persecution by radical Muslims has been. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that all these radical terrorist movements were funded and started by either Western or Soviet sources. Now, the Soviets, for example, sponsored the PLO, who pioneered aircraft hijackings. But the Americans have funded much, much, much worse than the PLO in ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And just think what the women are going through in the Middle East. They are enslaved, to put it nicely. Well, I've documented some of our work amongst the Christians in the Islamic country of Sudan, Faith and Defiance Sudan, but probably one of our most successful books was Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, the Historical Roots and Contemporary Threat. The first edition got me a death threat fatwa, and we thought, well, if they appreciate that much, we must bring out another edition. The second edition was twice the size, and then the third edition was 3 times the size. And so we've had 4 printings and 3 separate editions, and Slavery, Terrorism, Islam at one stage was on sale on Amazon for $1,000 for a book. And considering we sell them for $10, it just seemed a bit extreme. So we just kept printing more. And we obviously target somewhere with a Slavery, Terrorism, Islam book. We've helped different filmmakers produce films on Sudan, Sudan in the Holocaust, terrorism and persecution, understanding Islamic jihad. The Muslim Middle East is the most resistant, needy, neglected mission field on earth. Also the site of the worst persecution of the Christian church. So that's why we need to pray for the Muslim world. We need to be focused on what's going on in the Middle East right now. We've done Muslim evangelism workshops, and it's important not to see Africa just in terms of national flags, but see it in terms of people groups and different religious groups that need to be reached. People are not just a national identity, they are a part of certain tribes, religious groupings, language groups. So some years ago, I tried to make sense of the Arab Spring, what was going on there. And they were talking about this Arab Spring, which was some kind of flourishing of democracy and freedom and tolerance and all kinds of good things. But the tidal wave of protests and riots, which convulsed the capitals throughout the Arab world, heralded a seismic shift in world politics. And at the time, nobody could have guessed it was all funded by USAID and coordinated by the CIA and the US State Department. More than 1 million demonstrators on the streets on a single capital, day after day, calling for the resignation of what they called authoritarian leaders, some of whom had been in power for decades, created consternation not only in the Middle East, but throughout the world. And it needed to, because in every case, what replaced these leaders was much, 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 much worse. And so from Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Yemen, Jordan, Egypt, Bahrain, Iraq, there were protests, and these were coordinated by USAID. And it was a cell phone mobilized protest. So, I think they used Twitter and Instagram and all these different social media platforms to mobilize the crowds to meet at this place. And it was so coordinated, and many of the images circulated of atrocities of the governments were fake news, manufactured, false flags, and so on. And Tunisia was the first country to be targeted. Tunisia is famous for being the location of the ancient Carthage, and Augustine, as in St. Augustine, one of the greatest theologians of all time, came from Tunisia. Well, Tunisia was the first Arab domino to fall. And Tunisia was the first Arab country to abolish slavery in 1848, the first Arab country to have a constitution in 1861, the first Arab country to abolish polygamy in 1956, now the first Arab country to remove a dictator without, well, that's a lie, it wasn't without external help. In 2011, it was manipulated by external help. Tunisia had had only 2 presidents since independence from France in 1956, but the exploding public anger at corruption and sharp rise in prices sparked the protest in December and just went out of control. So in January, President Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia after 23 years of rule. And the interim government consisted of numerous ex-ministers from the previous regime, and the economic crisis which sparked the discontent in the first place continued, so further instability was expected. Tunisia had no history of Islamic fundamentalism, but radical groups like the Muslim Brotherhood exploited the instability. hijacked this popular revolution to turn Tunisia from a mostly secular state into a more radical Islamic regime with far more persecution of Christians. And this was mobilized by cell phones. It was the social media revolution. And these people thought they were so powerful. Their social media was changing the country. Only later they realized they were being manipulated by social media. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that the CIA actually funded and inspired the creation of Facebook, for example, to make it easier to spy on people. And so the social media, they had a back way into the social media to manipulate it too. These are all good photo images sitting on tanks, flowers and rifle barrels. But this has got to be pretty scary, especially when it's throwing firebombs at people. And you don't want to get petrol and fire on you. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible way to get injured. But overturning cars, setting cars alight, and look at all the stones on the ground. People making shields out of somebody's roofing, rocks in the air. This is not something peaceful. You won't see this at one of our pro-life protests, for example. And then somebody just pulled off his motorbike and are starting to be kicked and beaten by these peaceful crowds that are of happy protesters. So understand when somebody finds himself being dragged along on the ground, well, if you don't want to get dragged on the ground like that, don't throw stones and firebombs. Look at those rocks in each hand. These are some of the peaceful protesters. It doesn't take much to get a mob to turn ugly and violent. Baseball bats. What are you going to do with a baseball bat? And then looting, of course, looting's part of it. Nothing spells freedom more than being able to loot some poor shop owner's property. And these were actually pretty well organized events, and the photography is often spectacular. Many of these journalists were employed to do this job, and we discovered recently that USAID had 6,500 journalists they were paying, and they controlled 707 media outlets, including the BBC, which shouldn't surprise anyone. But some high-quality photographs being taken of confrontations and trying to be able to whip this movement even further through social media. I mean, even this game over, that's not in Arabic, that's in English. This has been done as a media play for overseas consumers. Ben Ali is out, who's next? So again, showing this idea, the goal here is regime change. Toppling one government, start with an easy government like Tunisia, but then we're going on to bigger ones like Syria and Egypt. One dictator down, all others to go. The roses, this is orchestrated. I mean, this is a set picture. You can imagine this is a journalist's dream to get these kind of pictures. It's in English as well as Arabic. They've got the flowers, they've got the images. This is all well planned. I mean, even this imagery of the dominoes. Tunisia is the first domino to go, all the other dominoes are going to go, and there's some bureaucrat trying to hold up the dominoes. Slime magazine, revolution, what it means for the Middle East. And these are all propaganda items. We now know that Time magazine was also being funded, bribed by USAID. And Egypt was once one of the greatest countries in the world. The relative political stability under President Hosni Mubarak for over 29 years came to an abrupt end in 2011. Mubarak's regime was mostly secular and pragmatic, and Islamic groups grew greatly in strength despite the suppression from Mubarak's government, and despite the ban on religious parties running for parliament. The radical Muslim Brotherhood gained 20% of the elections in parliament by running as independents, but they were still Islamicists. Mubarak's military government limited the numbers of seats by imprisoning a number of Muslim Brotherhood members of parliament. They also placed soldiers outside every church to protect the Christians. Now, Egypt is home to one of the most ancient civilizations in the world. Also the most important Arab country, the largest population of any Arab country, 84 million. Islam is a state religion. But there are over 10 million Christians, mostly Coptic Orthodox, make up 12% of the population of Egypt. And for over 1,000 years, Egypt was a majority Christian population. Even after the Muslim Arabs conquered them in 640 AD, Christians continued to be the majority for another 500 years. Incredibly, the Egyptian church has survived 14 centuries of Islamic discrimination and persecution. This is a resilient church. These are tough people. But violence against Christians in Egypt has escalated sharply over the last 14 years. And churches have been targeted for car bombings. And the Islamic takeover in Egypt was a massive crisis because the country had so much influence in the peace process, the first Arab country to sign a peace treaty and have normal trade with the State of Israel. Egypt was America's key regional ally, the first Arab state to make peace with Israel. And in fact, President Anwar Sadat was the real architect of that peace deal, which somehow Jimmy Carter got the credit for. And then the vital Suez Canal was controlled by Egypt, of course. Suez Canal is super important, linking the Atlantic and the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. And just a view from above, how phenomenally important the Suez Canal is, that you can cut thousands of kilometers of travel off for vessels traveling between Asia and Europe. And Egypt controls this. And it's one of the most important naval choke points in the world. And so it's important that the country that runs this is a stable country. I mean, just imagine sailing from sea to sea with desert on both sides. Phenomenal. Iran and Egypt severed diplomatic ties after the 1979 revolution because Cairo had a peace treaty with Israel and Iran regarded that as anathema. The Ayatollah Ali Khamenei compared the turmoil in Cairo to the period before the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979. And that was not a good thing, and that's not over yet. As we know, Iran is itching for a fight with Israel and anyone else that they can get into too. I think they would like a nuclear exchange in a world war because it sort of fits their apocalyptic end times visions, and the Mahdi will come to power in the middle of all this chaos. And so they've got a very strange view and a very confrontational attitude. So the popular uprising in Egypt was described by the Iranians as an Islamic awakening, not a democratic Prague Spring type of thing. And they believed this could lead to the establishment of an Islamicist Middle East led by Iran, dedicated to the extermination of the State of Israel. Now, there's a big myth of the moderate Muslim majority. Where the crisis escalating throughout the Arab world, Western governments faced the conundrum of their own making. For many years, Western governments and the media kept repeating their liberal mantra that the vast majority of Muslims are moderate and against terrorism, which is actually a bit of a myth. This is now shown to be a self-deceiving fallacy. Surveys and opinion polls in Egypt revealed 59% of Egyptians backed the Islamicists. Only 27% backed the modernizers. 50% of Egyptians support the radical Hamas terrorist group. 30% of Egyptians supported the even more violent and more radical Hezbollah. 20% of Egyptians expressed support for Al-Qaeda. 95% of Egyptians wanted greater Islamic influence in politics. So where's this tolerant majority that they kept talking about? The proposed solution by the Western liberals to virtually any problem worldwide was that of ballot box democracy. It's not going to work in a Muslim Middle East. We've been saying so for a long time. And this has been what the globalists have been saying for ages. And this is why America thought they could invade Somalia and shoot people to accept their aid and accept the food we bring you. That's why they could invade Iraq and Kuwait and go into all kinds of different wars, Afghanistan and so on, because the solution to every problem is liberal Western democracy. Remake the whole world like us. So it's refreshing in America now as a government that wants to just leave everyone else alone and protect their own borders and build up their own country. That would be refreshing change. And so the toppling of Saddam Hussein in Iraq did not bring about an improvement in lives for the people who lived there. The result in each case being more radical Islamicists in power. That's what democracy produces. Far more persecution of Christians than had ever been experienced in Iraq before. And effectively the genocide of Christianity that had lived in Iraq for about 1,800 years. And so you can see in Egypt there's real chaos that came. In 2003, the American President George Bush declared, "Are the peoples of the Middle East somehow beyond the reach of liberty? Are they never to know freedom?" And of course, his idea of freedom was very different from what we would think. I would say George Bush didn't understand that the solution to the Middle East is not political. There's no military solution to the problems of the Middle East. The problem is only spiritual. You need missionaries, you need evangelism, you need discipleship, you need Bibles. Until the Middle East is won to Christ, democracy is not going to work there. Simple. The religion of Islam is diametrically opposed to the Western world's concept of freedom. Either Islam will die or freedom will die. People who say behead those who insult Islam and freedom go to hell are not going to find the ballot box a solution. The Islamic concept of freedom bears no resemblance to the Western concept of freedom. Islam defines freedom in a way that we would regard as slavery. That's exactly what Islamic scholars define freedom as. Ibn Arabi, the Islamic scholar, says freedom is perfect slavery to Allah. The Muslim definition of freedom is submission, subjection to Sharia law. That's what it means to be a Muslim, one who is in subjection. A Pew World Opinion Survey by the University of Maryland World Opinion Survey found 84% of Egyptians favor the death penalty for apostates. That's for a Muslim who chooses to leave Islam, become a Christian or anything else. And they have hung people, like in Iran, this woman was hung because she confessed that she'd been a victim of rape. And according to Sharia law, the woman is always to blame for the rape, because women have the power of enticement. Therefore, the woman gets hung, the man might get a slap on the wrist, maybe. And so the rapist goes free, but the victim gets hung. That's Islam, that's Sharia law. Here they are burning in effigy the Prime Minister of Egypt, and 95% of Egyptians say they want Islam to play a major role in politics. 74% of Egyptians favored a strict enforcement of Sharia law, meaning cutting off of hands and feet and that sort of thing. So 67% of Egyptians favored a caliphate, a military dictatorship uniting all Muslims under Sharia law. So what do they mean by freedom? 90% favor freedom of religion is not considered a contradiction in Muslim eyes. Freedom of religion, they mean submission to Islam. So to Westerners, freedom means the exact opposite. So we're not talking the same language. Islam does not recognize any other religion as valid. What we in the West understand as freedom of religion to Muslims means freedom for Islam alone. You speak to a Muslim and say, do you support religious freedom? He says, yes. He means there should be freedom for Islam. And we think freedom for all religions, that's not the way they think. The danger of the radical Muslim Brotherhood, one of the most violent Islamic terrorist groups in the world, hijacking the revolution in Egypt. In fact, that's what America did. They basically put the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood destroyed 70 churches in Egypt on one weekend. First weekend to celebrate that. And it's a good thing that the Muslim or Egyptian army seized power and kicked the Muslim Brotherhood out and put them in prison. Because if it was up to Barack Hussein Obama, Egypt would still be under Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptian government leaders publicly declared their astonishment that America's president, Barack Hussein Obama, betrayed them into the hands of the radical Muslim Brotherhood, which the Egyptian military had to overthrow. And then Barack Hussein Obama put sanctions on Egypt for restoring law and order and getting rid of these terrorists. The Egyptian government was shocked that the Obama administration openly advanced the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood and worked for the downfall of the pro-Western Mubarak regime. Christians in Egypt need your help. Mubarak had been a staunch American ally, the recipient of billions of dollars of military aid. They had long been considered the major stabilizing force in the volatile Muslim world and the Arab Middle East. But the mobs in the streets were being inspired by Barack Hussein Obama being video projected on there to inspire them to rise up and overthrow the government. As it said, to be America's friend is fatal. And these things were orchestrated, even the destroying of government pictures and posters, and this was orchestrated by the USAID people on the ground. Observers noticed that the Obama administration's support for the revolutionaries in the streets of Cairo was strikingly reminiscent of Jimmy Carter's betrayal of the American ally, the Shah of Iran, and support for the Islamic revolutionaries in Iran in 1979. And so Carter had Iran, Obama has Egypt as their legacy. This is the massive protests mobilized by USAID. This marked the birth of the modern Islamicist revolution. I mean, the betrayal of Iran under the Shah. And the Iranian cleric Ahmed Khatami on Iran's radio Zameni declared, 31 years after the victory of the Islamic Republic, we are faced with the obvious facts that these movements are the aftershocks of the Islamic Revolution. So he's speaking about the Arab Spring, that it's an echo of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The fate of those who challenge our religion is destruction. And again, these are not very spontaneously produced posters. These have obviously been printed by the embassies, and next thing, the Iranian Navy was sailing through the Suez Canal. And Hammond Said, the leader of Jordan's Muslim Brotherhood, warned the revolution in Egypt would spread across the Middle East until the Arabs succeed in toppling all leaders allied with the United States and Europe. And Europe and America were paying for this. The prominent Muslim cleric Abu Muhammad al-Sheikh issued a fatwa encouraging the protests in Egypt, claiming Islamic jihadists were now on the verge of a historic moment, an earthquake similar to the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City. And the balance of power in the Middle East was about to be severely shaken and dramatically realigned. And imagine, this was paid for and orchestrated and incited by the American government. Just extraordinary. There was a time that you would have thought revolution came from Moscow, but more recently it's been coming from Washington, D.C. And this is all in Egypt. When the armored cars moved in to restore peace, the mobs just climbed all over the armored cars, which is something the Americans thought of and recommended to them. And then spray painted graffiti on the sides of the tanks. Water cannon didn't disperse the people either, nor did the tear gas. And even on the bridges in Cairo, bringing out water cannon didn't exactly discourage the people at all. You can see the tear gas noise. These were orchestrated, well-organized attacks, and you can only feel sorry for the poor police and army who were caught up in it. And this is roughly what our poor friends in Syria have just gone through. But it happened earlier in Egypt. With the White House giving support to the Muslim Brotherhood, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the Muslim Brotherhood is a force for peace and moderation in the Middle East. And often during Iranian-supplied Qassam rocket attacks from Gaza, Israel now feared that the cities and towns could be hit with the full brunt of the Iranian arsenal, which they have been recently. And Iran could replace the United States as Egypt's main supplier of military weapons. Now, since the 1978 Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt, which Sadat really was the orchestrator and architect of, although Jimmy Carter got the Peace Prize for it, US taxpayers provided $63 billion in aid to Egypt alone. The state of Israel now has to fear that Egypt could become part of the Iranian pact in the Middle East, along with Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups. Now, if this had succeeded, if the Egyptian military had not retaken Egypt, Israel could today be facing Iran and Egypt and Hezbollah and Hamas. I mean, can you imagine what that would look like? The Muslim Brotherhood takeover in Egypt heralded the imposition of Sharia law, drastic increase in persecution of Christians, and open hostility with the state of Israel, because the Muslim Brotherhood said the extermination of Israel is one of their highest goals. So how did the state of Israel handle this? The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned the Knesset, the future of Egypt and that of Egypt's ties to Israel hung in the balance. We have two separate worlds here, two opposites, two worldviews, that of the free democratic world and that of the radical world. Which one of them will prevail in Egypt? The answer to this question is crucial to the future of Egypt, of the region, and to our own future here in Israel. The Iranian regime is not interested in seeing an Egypt that protects the rights of individuals, women or minorities. They're not interested in an enlightened Egypt that embraces the 21st century. No jokes. They want an Egypt that returns to the Middle Ages. They wanted Egypt to become another Gaza, run by radical forces that oppose everything that the democratic world stands for. We oppose the forces that seek to enforce a dark despotism, terrorism, and war. It is naivety to think you can bring stability to a region by Western democracy. The Muslim Brotherhood hijacked the popular revolution in Egypt. They were the same Muslim Brotherhood who had taken part in the assassination of President Anwar Sadat in 1981. Do you remember seeing this? President Sadat was sitting in his presidential box, watching his army parade in front, and then suddenly a whole lot of Islamicist Muslim Brotherhood members of the army got off their truck and started machine gunning the presidential box and killing not only the president, but a whole lot of other people too. And that was the same Sadat who had made the peace accords with Israel, and therefore the Muslim Brotherhood targeted him. And they had forced for peace and moderation in the Middle East. The Muslim Brotherhood birthed Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda terrorists that all grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hillary Clinton called them a force for peace and moderation. And out of the Muslim Brotherhood came Awan al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's deputy. So al-Zawahiri grew up in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. He is jailed for his involvement in the assassination of President Sadat. But nevertheless, despite their radical statements and their bloody track record, Western government leaders went out of their way to claim the Muslim Brotherhood is a force for moderation in Egypt, and that they weren't violent and they were not extreme. With Western leaders like that, like Hillary Clinton, why do you need enemies if you've got friends like that? And this is what the Muslim Brotherhood was into. And notice the hangings from the lamppost. This is moderation in force. And then one could speak about Yemen, but they've got their own wars and so on. Yemen has degenerated into a horrible civil war. Let me skip past that for the sake of time. And there's no religious freedom for their population. Yemen is an interesting country, but there's no religious freedom or toleration for dissent there. And these are the countries that got targeted and undermined. And again, these nice pictures of somebody holding up a flower, that's just a photographic set. It's a photo op to promote propaganda. And these poor countries destabilized, all these people's lives, given some hope, but you work up a mob and people are going to get injured. Algeria was another place where democracy brought the Muslim Brotherhood equivalents in Algeria to power, and then the military had to stage a coup to get rid of the democratically elected radical extremists and bring some stability to the country. And that's just another example of how the Western democracy turns out to be worse than the disease they're trying to cure. Sort of like chemo. Chemo in many cases is worse than cancer, so the cure can be worse than disease. Western democracy is going to solve the problem, but no, in fact, it can make it much, much, much worse. And Libya. Now, Libya was under a military dictatorship, but the fact is Libya was stable. They also had a high standard of living because they found a lot of oil. And they had high unemployment, a lot of poverty, but Iran didn't have that. That solved those problems. So the targeting of Iran, they got bombed by NATO. France and Britain bombed them over and over, destabilized this country until Iraq, I should say on this occasion, Libya was overthrown. And so these posters, well-made posters, nicely printed, and these are not accidental. These, again, USAID funded all this. Regime change, toppling of governments. And what followed after overthrow of Gaddafi, bad as he was much, much, much worse. And in fact, the chaos, the whole of Libya has just become a failed state and used to be a stable country. But the result of these topplings of governments was millions of migrants pouring into Europe, in this case into Italy, and a demographic time bomb moving into Europe. So the destabilizing of North Africa was deliberately done in order to destabilize Europe as well. And chaos, this is not good. When people are burning and looting things, again, this is a well-orchestrated photo op designed by the photographer. People are looking at what's got to come, what it's got to look like. Again, taking off your shoe and smacking a picture, that's a very Arab way of insulting someone. Total chaos in a country that used to have a very high standard of living. And then we talk about Saudi Arabia is the most oppressive, the most brutal regime in the Arab world. No criticism of the government's allowed. Beheading of people is normal. I think in 1 year they beheaded 165 people, including a Saudi princess. A Saudi princess was beheaded because she converted to Christ. There was an ITV film made on the death of a princess, which was not able to be shown on independent television in Britain or on PBS, public broadcasting in America, because oil companies complained because they'd gotten a phone call from the Saudi embassy. And there's this businessman who drowned his daughter in a family swimming pool because she had converted to Christ. And the family, friends were invited, and they stood around the pool applauding while the father drowned his daughter with her mother and brothers and sisters standing by. And no inquest, no charges. Why? Because to kill an infidel is not a crime in Saudi Arabia. And so public executions, tortures are normal in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is the state responsible as the custodian of the holiest sites in Islam, which is in Mecca and Medina. But there's not one church, not one synagogue allowed in all of Saudi Arabia. Not one Saudi citizen may be a Christian. 15 of the 19 al-Qaeda terrorists who carried out the September 11th terrorist attacks were Saudi Arabian citizens. But America instead bombed and attacked Iraq, who had nothing to do with it, and only gave extra aid and support to Saudi Arabia. So it's kind of a bit strange when Saudi Arabia is the focus of all al-Qaeda activity is funded from Saudi Arabia. But their vast oil reserves and their strategic location makes them a key American ally. It doesn't matter what Saudis do. They assassinate American journalists. They do all sorts of things like that. Not a problem because they're Saudi Arabia. And the House of Saud is too rich and too powerful to be easily swept aside by some protest in the street. But they are terrified by the developments of crowds in the street. Many Westerners who know little about Islam in the Middle East, the news of mass protests against dictatorships and calls for democracy sound like something good and a positive development. But in Arab countries where there's some measure of democracy, however tentatively, it invariably becomes radical Islamicists to come to power. So democracy is not the friend of Christians in the Middle East. An Islamic government is going to kill them for being Christians, whereas a secular government might leave them alone, like in Syria. And Morocco is another example of that. And just bear in mind, in Gaza, when they had elections in Gaza, Hamas won every time. And the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt is confident the majority of Egyptians will vote for them too, if they have a chance. Those who understand Islam in the Middle East are warning democracy will bring change, but it could be the worst kind of change, as Islamicist crescent stretching from Pakistan in the east to Morocco in the west. In the West, when you speak about gay guys hanging out, it's got a different connotation from the Middle East. And when you speak about girls being stoned, in the West, that doesn't mean the same as what it means in the Middle East. If European and American officials are worried about developments in the Middle East, you can only imagine what politicians and commanders in the State of Israel are thinking. These flashpoints across the Middle East, orchestrated by their friends and allies in America, are absolutely catastrophic. And of course, it can spread into Africa very easily, and it's come as far as Mozambique. We've got Islamicists beheading Christians. But this should have us all praying and concerned. We need to be far more vigorous in getting Bibles and missionaries into the Middle East. If democracy comes to Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood will seize power, like they did back in 2011. Their first actions would be to tear up the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty. That alone would hurtle this troubled region into even more deadly instability. This is a posed photograph. I mean, you can just see they had photographers specifically employed to get photographs like this for the Arab Spring. The fundamental, irreconcilable differences between most Israelis and Arabs means any outbreak of serious conflict could easily embroil the neighboring countries of Lebanon and Syria. And many feel such a war is inevitable. So Christians need to be praying through Operation World, the definitive prayer guide for every nation. We need to be praying for nations by name specifically, especially working our way through the Muslim Middle East. These countries are tinderboxes. The Third World War could spring out of any of these countries, especially Iran. And very few people know much about the Muslim Middle East, but that was the birthplace of Christianity. Remember, this is where the church began, in the Middle East. We need to be particularly focusing our prayers on congregations of Christians under pressure in the Middle East, like the Coptic Christians. And we need increased Christian missionary efforts to reach Muslims for Christ. These areas are mission fields. And so we're called to pray for the Muslim world. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. We need to smash the cultural Marxism that has been funding this stirring up of the hornet's nest in the Middle East. And being a mission to the persecuted, we believe the best thing is to evangelize our enemies. They come to us with hate, we need to go to them with Christian love. They come to us with bombs, let's go to them with Bibles. Instead of sending in the Marines, let's send in the missionaries. And this is the spiritual world war that's waging in Africa. The Muslim North, animist South, and then we've got Christianity, Islam, and animism, the three big forces that are battling for the hearts of Africa. So we've got our resources available on the Frontline Mission SA.org website, the book Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, and Muslim evangelism resources here. Faith Under Fire Sudan is an example where we won, where the Christians managed to successfully secede from Islamic Sudan, and that is, I believe, a pattern of success that we can use for the future. We've helped produce films that expose Islamic jihad and how to understand them, and Behind Enemy Lines for Christ has got a lot of answers to prayer. Countries that used to be closed to the gospel, like Mozambique and Angola, Behind the Iron Curtain, Sudan, and seen victories for the cross, answers to prayer, which I hope will inspire a new generation to respond to these challenges too.